The next several weeks were filled with car rides, security sweeps, and hotel stays for Deicide. He trudged around his lavish suite like a bored child. The abyss formed herself into a stout, oily caricature of a deathless soldier, and followed Deicide throughout the hotel, the two feigning a death march. He opened the room dividers and came upon Hellmouth and Great White playing some ancient human card game, as well as the rest of his staff lounging around, trading jokes and stories. Deicide sighed loudly, to make his presence and mental state known to the rest. It was said that the longer an individual's lifespan, the quicker they perceive time, but given the gift of eternal life from his wife's research, Deicide's own perception of time seemed to be frozen at the type of man he appeared, a man in his late 20s. He plopped onto an ottoman and stared up at the ceiling. "Hey, sir, let's watch a movie," Baby Sister said, attempting to appease the man before he began to brood, knowing that a bored Deicide would eventually wish to wrestle, an act that was guaranteed not only to upset Hellmouth, but the furniture, as well as the joints and muscles of those on his staff. Deicide groaned. "I'm sick of movies," he said. Hash threw his hand in the air. "Some ladies waiting down in the lobby," he said. "What did I say about picking up strays? If Aunt wanted his toys, he should have brought them," Hellmouth said. Some time ago, it had become apparent to Deicide that Hellmouth had not just been thinking about his security when she made such comments. What seemed to be self-hating misogyny was actually an older woman looking out for her fellow sisters. In actuality, she wanted to keep as many innocent women out of his clutches as possible, benign as they were. Though he possessed the right to wantonly pick any woman up that he fancied, Hellmouth had instilled in him the concept of consent and boundaries, causing him to discard potential lovers that seemed in any way indifferent or lacking in enthusiasm. Deicide stood up and went over to the table where his chief commanders were playing their card game, totally uninterested in the human pastime. He put his arms around Hellmouth, squeezed into the chair she was sitting in, and then placed his head on her right shoulder, sniffing at the barely detectable traces of perfume she wore. He'd always wondered who she kept as a lover. Her rank and the fact that she was a woman, no doubt, made her cautious about her private life, though it mattered little to anyone. But Hellmouth was from a time where women were judged for irrelevant criteria concerning their work, and it seemed she had held on to this archaic prudence. Still, he was curious, and he hoped his old girl was happy. Hellmouth gave a sidelong glance at Deicide resting on her shoulder, and then placed down her card. She continued to adjust the cards in her hand and was soon unable to resist affection from the man she could only think of as a boy, and leaned her head so it was touching his. "You're not going anywhere," Hellmouth said, without looking at him. Deicide lifted his head up. "But I heard they had this wonderful singer—" "No! If it wasn't in the itinerary, we can't go. Not's orders," Hellmouth said. "Not? I'm the captain," Deicide said. "Of course you are. You're such a cute captain, too," Hellmouth said, digging her finger into his cheek. Deicide huffed and looked to the Great White for some support, only for the man to shrug him away. "Don't pout. This is why you pay us," Hellmouth said. "I pay you to crush my enemies, not hold me hostage," Deicide said. "Lady Knot pays us to hold you hostage," Baby Sister said. "What were the lectures for?" "The training. All those push-ups and flutter kicks," Deicide said, recalling his younger years spent under the supervision of Hellmouth, Great White, and Icker. It had been their job to make the Eater program become reality, more than a pet theory. It had not been until he became a man that he realized how they could love him, yet push him near the borders of madness. They had grasped the importance of the mission long before he had. "Children need structure," Hellmouth said, "and we were fighting conventional enemies back then. Strength alone won't save you from terrorism." The woman was right, Deicide thought as he glanced at the fanatics in the corner. Different from the normal ranks of deathless and risk eaters, these eaters had no lives at all. They socialized little, even amongst themselves. They were a twisted combination of every type of eater that existed. They possessed the self-righteousness and sense of duty of risk eaters, the single-mindedness and indifference to pain displayed by the deathless, and the cold precision and willingness to do harm in exchange for good, as a weaver would. They treated their mission as a religion, and Deicide and the Yolopar were its idols. They carried necklaces which contained instructions on how to revive Deicide if he should ever fall, even if his body were to be completely eradicated. The amulets also contained a select portion of his memories. Though incomplete, they would be enough for Deicide to rebuild the machines, which would rebuild the Yolopal. The obstructions had made sure Deicide would be immortal. but even Deicide was not so sure, he being a clone himself. And from the archived memories of this man, he could see the Antinous Mian, the first, and the child soldier that became Deicide were completely different men. Their eyes were the same, but the feelings behind them were nothing alike. Deicide rose and went over to the display window and changed the scenery to a prison scheme, then shuffled back to his room. He fell onto his bed while the abyss chirped and cooed all around him before settling down next to him in the shape of a giant black teddy bear, attempting to cuddle next to him with stubby round nubs. Deicide angrily tried to push her and her condescension away before finally giving up with a sigh and slack limbs. She giggled at his annoyed consent, which was always inevitable. He turned so that his back was to her, and then loosened his collar before drifting off to sleep. He woke to dozens of people milling around him in the dark. The security shutters had covered the windows, and the emergency lights were warming up. He squinted in the darkness for a few moments before his nanomachine implants did their work, allowing him to see in the dark, and then it was like day to him once the security lights came on. The cloth uniforms of his staff were off, and their normally gray skids had gone black, filled with inert vestige material. Baby Sister was directly in front of him, silently motioning for him to follow her. It surprised him how mature and fearsome Baby Sister had gotten without his knowledge. He could still remember her and her other 11 siblings playing in his office as children. The smallest of the Rutherford clan had become a woman. Being from a family of loyal killers, she had become one herself. So Deicide only nodded and followed the woman's direction as she escorted him to the other side of the building. He had no reason to worry, not made sure he was surrounded by those that had quicker tempers than his own. They crept to the back entrance of the suite where Hellmouth and Great White were crouched at the door waiting, listening to information being passed over the network by units below. Then they nodded and grabbed hold of Deicide, rushing from the room. Eaters were already in the hall, their black spine blades out, held firmly. Even the pommels of these blades were lined with vestige. One did not let go of a spine blade until it allowed you to. The group moved down the hall silently, slightly touching so they could communicate through their subtle movements. It was a latent trait that all social creatures seemed to possess, but it had been heightened in eaters through repetition and time spent amongst their brothers and sisters. There were even those, like the Weavers, that had warped this trait into an almost telepathic power. It was said that an active Weaver pair were closer than lifetime lovers, or even twins. Not had admitted, when the program was in its infancy, that having such a relationship with anyone or anything was unhealthy. That everyone must be allowed to have their secrets. Everyone except Deicide. If he was as transparent to his lesser, then perhaps the resistance was gaining ground. He hoped that he was awakened for an actual cause. Through the hall they went without any trouble, until they saw the body of a risk-eater torn in half in the stairwell. The ruined remains of his brain were leaking through the top of his faceplate. Hellmouth nodded to Great White, and they moved to the front of the formation. The silent eater fanatics clustered around Deicide. As they shuffled down a few more stairs, a fist crashed through the wall. Dust and grit obscured its owner momentarily. Hellmouth shoved her spine blade through the mechanics of the cybernetic arm and dragged the rest through, widening the hole. She repeatedly slammed the cyborg's head against the metal railing before it eventually recovered, and then they were both sent rolling down the stairs. The Great White caught the submachine gun that was being raised from the darkness of the newly created hole. The gunman impotently spent the magazine into the floor as his throat was torn out by the White's jaws. Deicide smirked. He had not seen the Great White in action for some time, and it was good to know that he was still a shark god. Baby Sister and Hash followed from the rear, while the Elder Eaters slaughtered the cyborgs with a hate that was only reserved for rebel combatants. Eaters thought little of rebels who had failed to recognize their place in the chain of power. They had nothing, owned nothing, that had not been given or stolen from Deicide. And what parent would allow their child's toy chest to be pilfered? Hellmouth and White saw no better way to pay tribute to their little prince than with the blood of his enemies. Their black spine blades tore through the simulated flesh, and metal skeletons like needle through a swath of fabric. Coolant and blood speckled the walls in eerie glow of the emergency lights. Once in the garage, Deicide was hurried through ragged columns of hard-faced soldiers extending through the caravan of armored vehicles. Deicide's uniform was smeared with blood and brains that were not his own, and the abyss had begun to extract bits of it through pores in her strange flesh, not for any sort of cleanliness, but a light snack. She attempted to feed Deicide some of the gray morsels, holding it in two of her tendrils, which had become delicate, womanly hands. Deicide shoved it away, as well as her hand that was caressing his head and twirling his antennas. Not that Deicide had never tasted the flesh or blood of another, nor was he embarrassed to be seen doing so in front of his soldiers, only irked at the abyss's perverse mixture of violence, sensuality, and cannibalism. Even on their first meeting as a child, when Deicide had witnessed her true form, she had been naked, save for the blood covering her tiny frame atop the corpses of an army, whose innards she was scarfing with delight.